Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. A little while ago, Final Audio reached out and asked if I wanted to review the ZE3000. Having previously not had access to Final Audio products to demo, I was keen to use these as a stepping stone into hopefully a lot more Final Audio reviews. So first of all, let me know in the comments if there's any specific Final Audio products that you would like me to check out. But more importantly, the reason I'm sharing this is because I don't do a lot of true wireless content anymore. I tend to focus more on true audiophile wired type setups. But as it happens, after I got the ZE3000, HiFiMan then sent me the TWS800, which is their audiophile true wireless offering. And so when Edifier then reached out and offered to send me the NeoBuds Pro, I semi-reluctantly said yes, thinking that I could bundle them into this review, cover 3 of them at one time for those that are interested, without taking up too much of my schedule and taking me away from the core products that I normally focus on. As you're going to hear shortly, I'm so glad I ended up going down this path and comparing these 3 because 2 of them are excellent audiophile earphones, one of them is a feature-packed monster, but then one of them is also a little bit of a disappointment. And so make sure you watch on to find out which is which and see which earphone you should buy if you actually want audiophile grade wireless earphone quality. There's a couple of things I should cover off before I get into the review, and that is that whilst HiFiMan and Final Audio both claim to have special technology built into their drivers of various sorts, I'm not going to get too hung up on some of the marketing information and the general claims that these brands make. For me, it's all about how they sound, and that's what I'll be focusing on. On that same theme, that also means I'm not going to delve too deep into things like the touch controls and general functionality. And so, as is often the case with reviews of devices like this here on Passion for Sound, I'll only call out a specific feature if I find it to be an issue or particularly beneficial in some way. In my experience, all of the devices like this that I generally play with 99% of them, once you adapt to their own little intricacies and specificities that they might have, they all work pretty much the same, which is to say, fairly well. Some people are going to prefer one type of user interface, while others might prefer something different. I'm not going to try and give you my take on that because I think it's such a personal thing and could easily take the majority of this review away from talking about sound quality. No doubt there'll be other reviews around that will talk about things like user interface, but if you're watching this review, be prepared for the fact that it is 90% about sound quality. I'll talk a bit about the key features and comfort and the general design, of course, but I'm not going to get into the intricacies of how many taps do what on which earbud, how responsive those controls are. I'm not going to get into stuff like that. And so with all that said, let's jump into the review, starting off with the Final Audio ZE3000. The ZE3000 was sent to me direct from Final Audio, so thank you to them for sending it through. These retail for $149 US, making them pretty affordable overall. Now I've got the white ones here in my hand, but I've also got a pair of black ones here. I'm looking at maybe doing a giveaway for those. I haven't planned it yet, so do stay tuned and hit the subscribe button if you want to get a chance to win a pair of these. But the most important things you need to know is that Final Audio, if you're not familiar with them, are a Japanese audiophile earphone and headphone company. And so I expected very good things from the ZE3000. I'm not going to give anything away just yet about how they sound, but first I want to talk through some of the features and functions of these. They come, as you can see, in this nice little compact case. It's got a little flip top lid where you've got the earphones housed underneath. And as is always the case with true wireless earphones like this, the case provides some charge as well as what's built into the earphones themselves. On the ZE3000, that means you're going to get 7 hours per charge of the earbuds themselves, and a total of 32 hours including what's in the case. So my understanding is that basically the case is holding about 25 hours worth of charge, plus the 7 that's already in the earbuds. The fit and finish on the case and the earbuds is wonderful. It's finished in what's called a shibo finish, which I understand is a Japanese word referring to things like crinkled paper, and it's the type of finish you're probably used to seeing on high-end DSLRs, other cameras. It's sort of that wet look finish. It's like a matte finish with small glossy parts on it. It's a very beautiful look and feel. You will have seen it in the B-roll, and I really like it. Whether it's in the white or the black, I think these are a beautiful looking IEM. While we're talking about the design and the finish, these have an IPX4 rating, which means they're going to be okay with sweat, but that's kind of about it. So you probably wouldn't want to run with these in a heavy downpour or walk with them. They're not really an exercise-based IEM, but they're going to be okay with a bit of sweat. They're not rated for dust. That doesn't mean they're going to have problems with dust. The X just means there's no rating applied for it. When we pop open the case, on the inside we've got these angular little buds. So they're very angular looking, but they're also very comfortable. In much the same way as things like Campfire Audio Andrometers are comfortable despite the angles, the same can be said of the ZE3000. They're not the most comfortable wireless IEM I've ever worn. There's multiple others I've tried that are better, but they're certainly not bad by any stretch, and once they're in the ear, they're relatively secure and they are very comfortable. Part of what's delivering that comfort is the great range of tips provided by Final Audio. I know there's many fans out there of Final Audio's specific earphone tips, and what's provided with these are no exception to that quality. You get a nice range of tips with different structures, different bore sizes, so you can tweak and tune the earphones a little bit with your choice of tips, and of course make sure they fit you well. The final and perhaps most important thing about the design of the ZE3000s is the fact that they provide you with aptX Adaptive. If you haven't heard of that before, that's one of the Bluetooth codecs available. So most devices will have SBC or AAC as kind of the basic entry-level codecs, and then you can step up to aptX, aptX HD, and aptX Adaptive. Now aptX Adaptive is kind of the top of the tree there, but it's not necessarily better than aptX HD in sound quality. What aptX Adaptive does is adjust the amount of information being sent via the Bluetooth signal, so you're getting HD level quality if you're listening to music, but for things like phone calls where you don't need that sort of bandwidth, it's going to pull it back a little bit. So you can think of aptX Adaptive as essentially just as good as aptX HD. And certainly in my listening with the ZE3000, they sounded very much like a high-res Bluetooth codec. Now keep in mind, Bluetooth is still not lossless, but it can get very, very close with things like aptX HD, aptX Adaptive, and also LDAC that we'll talk about later. Listening to the ZE3000s, they produce a sound that I would describe as slightly brighter than neutral, or slightly brighter than natural perhaps. Having said that, it's a very enjoyable sound. These are a beautifully tuned IEM. It speaks to their heritage coming from a brand with such reputation and experience as Final Audio. They've got this wonderful sort of detail-focused sound, but it doesn't sacrifice musicality, and that to me is really important. I don't mind a headphone that leans towards a bit of treble emphasis and a bit of extra detail, as long as it does it without becoming sterile or overly focused on the treble. And for me, that's what the ZE3000s do absolutely perfectly. In balancing that tuning well, tonalities of all different instruments are generally pretty good, keeping in mind that everything is tilted slightly brighter than neutral, but they're still delivering bass that's both tight and pretty fast. So you've got a little bit of presence there, but also plenty of speed and a little bit of punch when you need it. They're not a bassy IEM, they're not something I'd recommend for lovers of bass, but there's enough there, as I said before, to keep the sound from getting soulless and lacking in that sort of groove and that drive when you need it. The ZE3000s throw a soundstage which has really good width. It's not particularly deep, but generally speaking no true wireless earphones are, but there's also no sense of congestion or lack of space from the ZE3000. It has just a little bit of depth so things don't feel like an absolute wall of sound, but things are largely left and right, but with good space in between all the sounds. Ultimately, after spending extended time listening to the ZE3000s, they're an earphone that I absolutely think is worth considering. I'm going to give you a full comparison of all three of these at the very end, but to start off with, just to summarise the ZE3000, if you're someone that enjoys that slightly detail-oriented, slightly treble-leaning sound, and I do mean slight, but it's definitely treble-leaning, if that's a sound style that you enjoy, the ZE3000s are absolutely brilliant at their $149 price tag. These could easily compete with some of the better budget IEMs around the sort of $100 to $150 mark, and those are going to require that you also buy a dongle or DAC of some sort. So if you just want a great pair of audiophile earphones to connect up to your phone, not worrying about dongles, not worrying about wires, the ZE3000 is potentially a good choice. But don't rush off and buy a pair just yet, because I've still got 2 pairs to go through. The next earphone in the mix here is the HiFiMan TWS800. If you've watched the channel for a while now, you'll know that I'm generally quite a fan of HiFiMan's headphones. I've now tried almost all of their planers. I've currently got over behind me their HER9, which is both a wireless and a wired headphone, and without giving too much away, I'm pretty impressed. And so the TWS800 came to me with fairly high expectations for their sound. Before we get to that sound though, as always, let's talk a bit about the device. It comes in this beautiful but fairly bulky charging case, and there's a couple of reasons I think for the bulky size. One of them is, as you'll see in a moment, these are quite a big earphone, but also this case has to hold a fair bit of charge. Just like the ZE3000s, the TWS800s will give you about just under 32 hours total listening time, including the case. But the reason I think they needed to build a bit more battery in here is that the earbuds themselves will only hold about 4.5 hours. Now that's not a huge problem. It's unusual, I would say, for anybody to use a pair of earphones for more than about 4 hours in one stretch. And so when you do take them off and pop them back into the case, they're going to get topped up fairly quickly. But it was surprising to me that the earphones use up the power so quickly, and therefore there's so much power needed in the charging case to recharge them multiple times over. None of that's an issue specifically, but I did think it was worth mentioning. Another thing that makes the case quite bulky is that HiFiMan have designed this case to house all sorts of different tips, and that's partly because the TWS800s come with so many tip options. You've got double flanges, triple flanges, single flanges of course. There's a huge range of tips. And so that's fantastic. If you can't get a fit and seal in your ear canal with these, there's something horribly wrong. The range of tips and options is exceptional. Having said that, you're kind of also going to need all those tips, because when you look at these, they are absolute monsters. These, in my opinion, are just too big as a wireless IEM. Unless you've got quite large ear canals and quite large conches, that's that bit that the earphone actually sits in. Unless they're big on you, there is a really good chance that these are going to stick quite a long way out of your ear. It makes them feel a bit awkward, it makes them feel less stable as well to me. I never had them try to fall out, but I certainly didn't feel like they were snug and in my ear the same way that either of the other two here did. So do keep that in mind. I think that's a bit of a drawback on the design of these. They don't feel as comfortable and they don't feel as stable, but they do come with an amazing set of tips to help you get them feeling as comfortable and as stable as possible with such a big IEM. Two other things I should mention is that these, like the ZE3000s, are rated for IPX4, so they're going to handle a little bit of sweat, maybe a tiny bit of drizzle, but they're not an all-weather IEM. And something else I want to mention, which I just find curious, is that HiFiMan specifically talk about these being a high impedance driver design. And I don't really understand why they're pushing that as a benefit. And there's two reasons for that. Firstly, it's a bit irrelevant. You're not plugging these into any amps, so the impedance going on inside means absolutely nothing. All of these have amplification to drive the drivers inside. And so whether it's a high impedance driver, a super low impedance driver, none of that means anything at all. The second reason I'm curious about it is because there's a potential that by making it a high impedance driver, they've actually reduced the battery life. That's quite likely why these only have 4.5 hours, where most true wireless IEMs on the market are comfortably hitting 7 hours, 8 hours, etc. from the earbuds alone. And so I'm not really sure why HiFiMan are touting that. There are some theories that would suggest that higher impedance headphones can sound better, but generally it actually comes down to the design of the driver, not what its nominal impedance figure is. There's nothing that says a 20 ohm driver is inherently worse than a 60 ohm driver, which is inherently worse than a 150 ohm driver. It all depends on the design of the driver and the amplification circuit driving them. I just realized when I glanced at my notes that I haven't yet told you the price of these. The TWS800 retail for $299 US, so that's significantly more than the $149 ZE3000s that I've already raved about. Add to that price tag the fact that they are a bit bulky and they're not the most comfortable because of that bulk, and all of a sudden the TWS800 is on slightly shaky ground. Unfortunately, to make matters even worse, the TWS800 doesn't offer any high-res Bluetooth codecs. There's no aptX HD, there's no aptX Adaptive, and there's no LDAC. So you're stuck with the basic SBC and AAC codecs. And to me, for a $299 audiophile level IEM, that's unacceptable. So I was pretty disappointed when I had a look at these, when I paired them up to my phone, when I went to look to see if I could switch on LDAC and discovered it wasn't there, then checked the box and discovered that aptX HD isn't even there, but I was prepared, of course, to give them the benefit of the doubt. I have had IEMs in the past that haven't had HD codecs and have still sounded great at their price point, and so I thought maybe HiFiMan had crafted some magic and made these really outstanding. Unfortunately, all I can tell you is that they're quite nicely tuned, the sound is quite good, but they really can't stack up to the ZE3000 because of the lack of detail and resolution and refinement that comes with the high-level codecs. In addition to that, I find the tuning of the 800s gets just a little bit shouty and a little bit sibilant sometimes. There's a peak around 4 to 5k that can be quite troublesome on some tracks. And their overall tuning does create a slightly uneven, and it's very slight, but a slightly uneven sense of tonality across the board. There's this little bit of attack and extra energy in the treble. They've got a fairly smooth and rich bass, but there's a little bit of a hole somewhere in the middle. As I just mentioned, the bass is relatively present and full, but it's not overly fast or punchy. It's not slow or bad, but it's just a bass that's got a bit more richness and warmth, more so than speed and punch. Where the 800s definitely do have some strength is they throw a beautiful soundstage with a bit of extra width and a really nice sense of imaging. Once again, depth is fairly limited, that's pretty standard for the course with wireless earphones, but their general qualities of imaging, image separation, and the general size of the soundstage is definitely a strong point for the TWS800. So I don't think these are an absolute write-off as an IEM. If you got yourself a good deal on a pair, or you'd already bought them, you haven't done a bad job, they're not a bad IEM, but in the competition I've got here, they don't stack up to the ZE3000 in my opinion. I think in particular, this comes down to their price tag. If these were priced a little bit below the ZE3000, I'd feel a lot better about them. But for basically $300 US, they're very expensive for a true wireless, and they don't stack up against competition like, say, the Samsung Galaxy Buds Pro, which has been my long-term kind of go-to reference for true wireless. They just don't stack up on features and or sound quality. And so I'll still give you a comparison with these against the ZE3000 and the Edifiers when we get to the end, but for now I'm going to say that unless you specifically want the sort of tuning that these have, I don't really see a benefit in buying them. They're more expensive, they're less comfortable, and they also don't have some of the features and technology like aptX HD, Adaptive or LDAC. And so with those out of the way, let's now talk about the Edifiers. Quite a while ago now, Edifier sent me their R1280dB bookshelf speakers, Bluetooth bookshelf speakers, for a review on the channel, and if you've seen that review, you'll know how much I enjoyed them. For their price, their performance and feature set I thought was excellent. At the same time, they sent me the W1280 wireless active noise cancelling headphones, and whilst I didn't review them in depth, I spoke about them in the speaker review, talking about how much I enjoyed them. In fact, to give you an update on that one, the Edifiers have become my go-to wireless noise cancelling headphone that I use when I'm listening to music around the house, when I go to bed and listen to an audiobook, all sorts of things like that. They've become my go-to wireless headphone. And that's part of why I said yes to receiving the NeoBuds Pro, was that I've been incredibly impressed with the Edifier devices I've tried recently. And as you might have already gathered if you remember my intro where I said that one of these was a feature-packed beast, you might have already gathered after hearing my review of the Final Audio and the HiFiMan offerings that that feature-packed beast is sitting in the middle here. And it's the Edifier NeoBuds Pro. Now to be really clear, each of the companies themselves have sent me these units. There's no money, there's no kickbacks, there's no benefits in me liking one over the other. This is purely me as an audio lover deciding which one I find the most fun. And the Edifier NeoBuds Pro are head and shoulders above the other two. At $130 US, they're slightly cheaper than the Final Audios. And despite having a different design, I think they're right up there in terms of the perceived sense of quality that you get with the Edifiers compared to the Final Audios. Talking through first the features that make me like them so much. We've got this lovely compact carry case, which is on par basically with the Final Audio, other than the fact that there's this really cool light on the front that reminds me of something out of Star Wars. I don't know if you can see it in the camera there, the way the red light comes on and it moves around and does things. It's just a really cool little feature. It just lights up to tell you all sorts of different stuff, whether it's that it's charging, whether it's that it's in pairing mode, all sorts of great little features. Speaking of pairing mode, there's a really simple button built into the case that will trigger pairing, which makes it super easy. You don't have to remember some random set of button presses or any kind of app to get into pairing. Just press and hold and away you go. They're also really compact, and that turns into them being super duper comfortable. And on top of that, they've got a set of tips which is probably rivaling the Final Audios. They may not be quite as good as Final Audio tips, but they're very, very close. According to Edifier, they're antibiotic, which I think is like antibacterial. I've never heard something like that called antibiotic before, but the theory I'm guessing is they're more likely to stop you getting ear infections and the like if you're wearing them while you sweat, while you do activities, or just putting them in and out of your ear for a long period of time. One area that these do fall short of the Final Audios is that they only give you 6 hours per charge with the earbuds compared to 7 from the Final Audio, and the total charging time from the case and the earbuds is only 24 hours. So you're about 8 hours short of what the Final Audio does, but it's still giving you lots and lots of time. Much like both of the other sets in this review, the rating on these is IP54, and in other words what that means is that for moisture they're identical, they'll handle a bit of sweat, maybe some very light rain if you're out and about. But in addition to that, Edifier have also provided a 5 rating for the dust capabilities. Now that's still pretty modest. That doesn't mean you're going to want to take them out and work in a really dusty environment over and over again with them, but it's nice to know that they do have some level of resistance to dust ingress, and therefore should last you better if you're out and about, maybe using them while you work, depending on the work you do. And so to this point, there are some things that I like about the Edifier NeoBuds Pro, but not enough that it absolutely separates them from the Final Audio ZE3000. Where that starts to happen is when we get to the point where we start to understand that these also have noise cancelling capabilities. They also have a control app that gives you access to a 4-band parametric equalizer, and they offer LDAC and LHDC, which is essentially a non-Sony version of LDAC. So all of a sudden, you can probably start to understand why I'm calling these a feature-packed monster. There is pretty much nothing that the Edifier doesn't do, assuming it sounds good, and we'll get to that in a moment, but on paper and in terms of the use and the functionality of these, they are absolutely stellar. In fact, the only complaint I can really level at them, in fact 2 complaints. The 2 complaints I'm going to level at the NeoBuds Pro is that I don't like the fact that when you've got the app installed, it permanently puts a notification bar on your screen, even when they're disconnected. Now there might be a setting buried somewhere that I can turn that off. I haven't gone hunting, but the fact that it's defaulting to that, I do find a bit annoying. I don't need an extra bar in my notifications telling me the earphones are disconnected when I clearly know that. I've disconnected them, or the music stopped if they run out of battery. So that to me is a bit of an annoyance, but it's super duper minor. They do also, of course, work without the companion app installed. And then the only other minor gripe is that, based on what I read in the manual, where you're meant to touch them for the controls is a little bit ambiguous. I'd been touching where I understood I was meant to touch, and nothing was happening. It was only through trial and error that I found out that where you're meant to touch is just below the microphone grill at the top of the stem. On the instructions, it looks like it's actually above the microphone grill. So that was a little bit annoying, having to fiddle around with that, but they're really the only complaints I've got in terms of the user interface. And so with that said, let's talk about their sound. As you've probably already guessed from how I introduced these, the sound is also nothing short of exceptional. These come with 2 modes kind of pre-built in that you can select from the app. They arrive defaulting to what's called dynamic mode, and that gives a bit of a bass boost and a little bit of a treble lift, making them quite a V-shaped IEM. After playing around a bit, I found myself preferring the classic mode, and so what I'm about to share with you is all about how they sound in that more neutral, more flat classic setup. Overall, the NeoBuds Pro sound very natural and very true to life. They've got enough treble to come across sounding detailed and articulate, but not overbalancing and taking it away from a natural sound. They've got excellent bass extension, and there's both a combination of speed and presence in the bass. They've got thump and punch when you need it, but they never overdo it, and vocals have a good balance of textures and weight behind them from that bass. Mid-range quality is in general very clean, very articulate and very natural, and the soundstage, like all of the IEMs in this roundup, has a nice combination of width, a little tiny bit of depth like all of them, not too much, and beautiful image placement as well. In fact, it's very hard to split any of these on pure soundstage. It's more about their tonality, their detail retrieval, and their overall sense of coherence of sound, which we'll get to in a second with a single track comparison of all three IEMs. Ultimately, as I listened to the Edifier NeoBuds Pro, mostly in classics mode, I found them just incredibly enjoyable, incredibly natural, a wonderful sense of detail, but also with the right amount of bass and presence to always sound lifelike. Moving into dynamics mode makes them a bit more fun, but can make them a bit fatiguing as well, so do be aware of that. When you first get these out of the box, they can sound a little bit unnatural because of that V-shaped tuning, and they can get a bit fatiguing. So my personal recommendation, if you're coming from more an audiophile space, is you might prefer the classic sound. But the beauty of it is, you can switch between the two easily, or you can use the 4-band parametric equalizer to set up your own. And so with all that said, let me give you one final comparison of all three of these on a single track to really put it into context how they perform against one another from a pure sound quality point of view. For this test, I was using my Samsung Galaxy S21 Ultra. I had the maximum sound quality settings for each of the IEMs, meaning that I was using aptX Adaptive for the Final Audios, I was using LDAC for the Edifiers, and sadly I had to default to SBC for the HiFiMans because they don't give you a choice. For anyone familiar with the Edifier NeoBuds Pro, they do give you the ability to tweak some of the settings, and so I'd absolutely maxed it out. In the LDAC menu, you can choose which bitrate's being used, you can choose the sample rate being sent, and so everything was pushed to full, and that's how I listened to them for this comparison. I did most of my listening at the basic LDAC settings, what it defaults to from LDAC, but for the sake of this comparison, I decided to crank everything up to full. The track I specifically listened to for these notes was 1.5 stars by Wilco, starting off with the NeoBuds Pro, and the sound was just right. The vocals had a natural tonality, they had a combination of texture and presence and body to them. It was just thoroughly enjoyable. When the kick drum comes in, it had punch, and it had a bit of weight to it as well. The decay wasn't too fast, but it also wasn't slow. It was nice and tight and punchy, but with a good sense of body. Having said that, the bass was in no way overdone. So it was just right, it was lifelike and natural. Again, listening in classics mode. In dynamic mode, it would boost it a little bit beyond natural, which can be a lot of fun, but it's not as natural as I prefer. From the NeoBuds, the guitar textures in this track are clean and articulate, but they're also well balanced with the natural resonance of the guitar as well. So you're hearing the full picture of the guitar, not just the detail of string interactions. And finally, as I've already mentioned, the soundstage is only modest in size. It's not a huge expansive soundstage, but each individual sound is very clearly placed and well separated from everything else. Moving over to the ZE3000 and repeating the same track, now the vocal is brought a little bit more into focus, but it's also a little bit thinner than it was on the NeoBuds Pro. It doesn't sound quite as lifelike because it's lacking a bit of body. It's not bad, it's not too thin overall, but in comparison, I felt like the NeoBuds Pro were just a little bit more true to life. As part of that new emphasis on the vocals, all of the other instruments were just slightly less prominent in the mix, and that can be really beneficial if you want specifically to hone in on vocals. The Final Audio ZE3000 could be an excellent choice. These are an earphone that I think of as kind of a deliberate tuning or a deliberate coloration to take you in a certain direction with the music, whereas I feel like the NeoBuds Pro are maybe just a little bit more honest across the board, and I don't necessarily mean that as a better or worse thing, they're just different. The kick bass I mentioned before from the ZE3000 is just a tiny bit lacking in presence and thump, but it's definitely still there and it's still very enjoyable. The textures of the guitar when listening from the ZE3000 are now slightly over-enhanced. And again, I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. It's done subtly enough that whereas with the NeoBuds Pro, there was a balance between the resonance of the guitar and the detail, with the ZE3000, it just cranks the detail up a tiny bit more, and so it makes them an earphone where you find yourself noticing and exploring the details and the textures, but the rest of the music is still available. It's not like it's become all about texture and all about detail. It's just like it's turned up the contrast ever so slightly. We're talking 2 or 3%, just enough so you start to notice those micro details that are there but not kind of brought forward at all in the NeoBuds Pro. Finally, while soundstage size is generally comparable between the NeoBuds Pro and the ZE3000, the ZE3000 does a few interesting things with placement. It seems to make the soundstage just a little bit less coherent. It creates a sense of a sound here and a sound there and a sound there, but they don't necessarily all tie together quite as evenly as it does from the NeoBuds Pro. And I think that just comes down to the bit of emphasis that Final Audio have put into the tuning of the ZE3000. Once again, it's not bad, it's not to the point that it distracts me and it takes me away from musical enjoyment, but when comparing the two, I did definitely notice it, and it's one of the reasons why I'm raving so much about the NeoBuds Pro. I had the ZE3000s for probably a few weeks before I got the NeoBuds Pro, and at that point, I was ready to come in and rave about the ZE3000s, and I still think they're great. I will still absolutely recommend them for anyone that for whatever reason doesn't want the Edifiers. But if you do have the two side by side as choices and options for you, I think the Edifiers do step ahead of the ZE3000s, and therefore they're two great options with one slightly better than the other in my opinion. And that of course brings us around to kind of the ugly duckling here. The TWS800 is just outclassed in this review. There's no doubt that they've got a lovely sound. In isolation, if you just had a pair of these, they're quite enjoyable. But at the $300 price tag and stacked up against the other two, there are just a few too many things holding them back. Even if we put aside the lack of aptX HD or LDAC, the sound from these isn't as nicely tuned as it is from the other two. Compared to the ZE3000, the 800s are a little bit richer down low, they've got a bit more warmth and fullness in the bass, but then they've balanced that off with some spikes in the treble, and that takes some of the vocals, particularly on this particular track that we're listening to, it takes the vocals into a space that gets a bit nasal and a bit too textured. There's also this kind of hole in between the treble and the bass, so somewhere in the mids things get not quite right, and as I mentioned before, there is occasional sibilance on certain consonants. What the tuning of the 800s does is really focus your attention on the upper registers of vocals and other mid-range instruments, and that to me isn't always a good thing. Sometimes it can be interesting, but sometimes it can really bite you. As an example of how these draw your attention to certain things, there's a scratchy kind of percussive sound used in the background of the recording of 1.5 Stars, and I never noticed it on the other two earphones. And I think that's because you're not really meant to. It's one of those things that a producer or an artist has put in as part of the overall kind of sonic landscape, but it's not a feature of the track, I don't think. And so when the TWS800 brings that to the front, I actually think it's doing a disservice to the music. Likewise, the 800s also kind of over-separate the sound of the guitar. What I mean by that is the textures of interactions with the strings are now kind of removed from the resonance of the guitar. It almost sounds like two different instruments because they're so unbalanced. This might make it sound like they're horrendous to listen to. They're absolutely not. If you told me I had to listen to these for a couple of weeks, I wouldn't complain at all. But they don't quite reach the level where I'd be happy living with these as my only wireless IEM. For me, the peaky tuning of the treble in the TWS800 has left them coming across a little bit incoherent, both in their tonal qualities, where you've got this lovely, rich, smooth bass that's very enjoyable, then you've got a bit of a hole, and then you've got this slightly over-enhanced treble. At the same time, that's producing a soundstage where things are a bit more broken up even further still compared to the ZE3000. It's not a completely unnatural soundstage, but it's not as coherent as either the ZE3000 or the excellent NeoBuds Pro. And so for me, as much as I like HiFiMan products, as much as I appreciate them sending this out, I can't really recommend the TWS800 at the end of all this, because you've got two contenders at about half the price or less that, in my mind, walk all over the 800s. And before I wrap it up there, I did quickly want to mention that I said before the Samsung Galaxy Buds Pro have kind of been my go-to reference audiophile level IEM for a while now. That's a wireless IEM, of course. And so I put those up against the Edifiers to see which one would come out on top. I feel like the Samsungs have the better sub-bass performance of the two. They do hit a little bit harder down low, although having said that, that's using the Edifiers in classics mode. I've got the Samsung Galaxy Buds Pro set, I think, to their soft setting, and that's partly because of one of the benefits of the Edifiers, which is I feel like the Edifiers are able to provide better clarity and texture without drifting into sibilance, which is something that I do find the Samsungs do sometimes. Depending on the EQ setting you choose with the Samsungs, some of them have excellent bass and wonderful mid-range, like the soft setting, but they lack a little bit of the clarity and detail that the Edifiers do. And then a different EQ setting might give you the clarity and detail, but push a bit too far into sibilance and overdoing the treble sometimes. So I do think the Edifiers have balanced the overall tonality a bit better, even though I prefer the bass presentation from the Samsungs. And of course, none of this takes into account the EQ options available in the Edifier. One area that I did feel like the Samsungs pulled ahead was they actually produce a better sense of depth in the soundstage than any of the IEMs here. It's still not a huge sense of depth, but it is very, very good for a wireless IEM. And it's an area where I don't think the Edifiers can compete. Ultimately, by the end of my comparison, I feel like if I had to choose between the two, I would lean towards the Edifiers for a few reasons. Firstly, they're significantly cheaper. I don't recall the retail price of the Samsungs, but they're well over $200 if I remember correctly. I also find that the Edifiers fit more comfortably and feel more secure. So the combination of sound quality, which both have their pros and cons, maybe the Samsungs edge ahead ever so slightly, but they're so close on sound quality that I'm then going to come back to the price and the fit and comfort. And with that in mind, I do feel like I would reach for the Edifiers given both options. And indeed, with both of them here, the Edifiers are the one I'm going to go to because I don't have to worry about getting a good fit and or have them fall out of my ear. And so at this point, I'm going to wrap all of this up by saying that of the three IEMs I've got here, as I've already covered, I'm not going to recommend the HiFiMan TWS800. I think it's overpriced and underfeatured. The tuning is not bad, it's got a decent sound that some people will really enjoy, but it doesn't stack up to the other two. I think the ZE3000 is absolutely a great choice if for some reason you don't want to buy the Edifiers, or if you're wanting that slightly more treble focused and yet still very enjoyable and musical and natural sound. The ZE3000s are a beautiful IEM. But if you were to ask me where I would spend my money on these three, or indeed any wireless earphone I've tried so far, and it's going to go to the Edifiers. You've got active noise cancelling, the best possible codecs available on the market right now, you've got a fit which is comfortable and secure, and they're a great looking device as well. So in my mind, it's an absolute no-brainer. The Edifier NeoBuds Pro get highly recommended by me. The ZE3000s do still definitely get recommended, and the TWS800s, with apologies, get forgotten about. So as always, I hope you found this review useful. I hope it's helped clarify your purchasing decisions on one of these pairs of IEMs. Maybe I've saved you some money, maybe I've helped you choose between the two you were tossing up between. Either way, I hope it's been helpful. If it has, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe, ring the notification bell, hit the like button, and let me and YouTube know that you want to see more videos like this one. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.